Hello and welcome to this special webinar from 42Crunch, why API security cannot wait until production. My name is Hugh Carroll and I'm head of marketing here at 42Crunch. We recently sponsored research by analyst firm Enterprise Management Associates, who surveyed over 200 technology and business leaders in North America about their attitudes and behaviors towards API security. And today we're happy to present you with some of their findings. But before we jump into the details, let me introduce you to our speakers. So firstly, we have Christopher Steffen, Vice President of Research for Information Security with EMA. Chris oversaw the research in conjunction with Ken Buckler, who's also of EMA. Christopher has a long career in the IT security industry as both an analyst and hands-on practitioner. Our other guest today is no stranger to those of you who follow 42Crunch. Colin Dominey is Chief Technology Evangelist here, and he also, in his spare time, edits the popular weekly industry newsletter, APIsecurity.io. Now, just some housekeeping rules before we get into the thick of it. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but can submit questions via the Q&A. Note also that a copy of this recording will be shared with you after the call. And I'm also happy to share with you a free copy of the research, which will be provided to all attendees after the webinar. So quick look at the agenda. Introduction to the study. I'm going to hand over to Chris to walk us through some of the methodologies and demographics underlying the research, and then present some of the results and analysis with an examination of some of the benefits of adopting an approach advocated by the research. And then we'll share with you links to some downloads which kind of reinforce a lot of the messaging coming out of the webinar. So Chris, happy to hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to talk to everybody here today, and thanks for taking time to listen to us a little bit about what's going on in the world of APIs. The reality is that this research was kind of interesting, and the results were the results were not exactly what we expected. We actually polled 230 different people. I almost ended up rejecting all the results and starting over. And then I realized that no, people are really kind of feeling this way about, their API security. There is a very big disconnect compared to what they actually think compared to what they're actually doing. And the research kind of shows that. But to kind of talk a little bit about, some of the demographics, we again, researched, or we pulled about 230 different people, a lot of information technologists. Obviously, that's where our focus was. When you take a look at the real breakdown on the next slide, we actually have a pretty good subset of different practitioner levels. We get a lot of IT directors, a lot of IT executives, but then there was a fair number of the movers and shakers that are actually taking and doing some of the work when it's all said and done. So pretty good cross section when it's all said and done. Here you kind of look at a real breakdown. We had anything from directors and executive types to that mid-level manager, directors and managers, and then lastly, about 8% of those that would be in practitioners when it's all said and done. Then the remaining bit was if they weren't a technologist per se or had a technical role, they were really kind of broken between the board of directors and a corporate line of business. And what I mean by a VP of operations or a VP of compliance or legal, and people who don't generally associate themselves with more technical roles. And then when we very deliberately wanted to take and have a study that was more focused on companies that were basically 1,000 employees or more, kind of get a better sense of some of the bigger companies, what they're feeling, so on and so forth. It doesn't really change the results a whole lot, but it is always important to kind of get a good mindset. We always take and try to use the number of employees instead of like overall revenues, because overall revenues is a really, really tough figure to kind of try to pin, your maturity and where you are, so on and so forth. And then lastly, we really covered the whole gamut of verticals. We wanted to make certain that we didn't have any one silo or vertical represented, overly much. So we really got a very good cross section from your usual technology companies and technology services and software to obviously the number one here was manufacturing, but obviously a lot in finance and financial services and retail and healthcare as well. So again, very, very good and strong cross section, which really spoke to, how we did the data collection, making certain that we're getting the kind of information that we really wanted to share and be able to contrast and compare. So there were several different results that we wanted to talk about. And as I mentioned before, some of the results were shocking. I guess I don't really know how else to say that. I think there is an overall expectation that your APIs are solid, that you're very mature in your environment. And the reality of it is that you find out that, maybe that's not so much the case. So one of the first things that I wanted to look at was, when you're looking at how controls are implemented for APIs, where are they implemented? Are they implemented, basically in a pre-production, in staging, or in a post-production? And this one was particularly interesting to me. Um, Basically, a third of all the APIs did not have controls or security controls implemented until they were already taken and put in production. Um, Very, very interesting. Again, the obvious expectation that I would have is that you're spending time in a dev environment and a QA environment, taking and testing those controls, making certain that they're implemented, and that's obviously certainly happening. But a third of the time, it isn't. And it's basically stick it out there, see if it works, and then hope for the best. Kind of frightening in the grand scheme of things. It's obviously possible that there are post implementation schemas that they need to implement. I'm not going to deny any of that, and there's obviously certain parts that you might want to do, but I think that my expectation was that a very large majority, a vast majority, would be done in a pre-production in a dev environment or some kind of testing environment, and that just turned out not to be a case. Colin, any thoughts about the fact that there was only a third that basically are implementing them? It's a third implementing after into production.
Yeah, I was wondering, the root cause of that. Do you think that's a legacy problem? The fact that we've been doing APIs for, better part of 2 decades or more now. Do you think we're just playing catch up with security? You think that's the
I do wonder that, right? I mean, I wonder if it is more of a legacy problem. I really hope that it's not a fire and forget kind of thing, right? It's one of those things where people have been using the same APIs for so long that that the expectation is that they're working, so they're just going to do some cursory testing in production and calling it good. So I think that you could be correct. I don't have specific data on it, but if you ask my gut feeling, I do feel that that's kind of the case.
Yeah, as you say, let's hope that is the case.
Yeah. So then the next one that I wanted to talk about a little bit was that 41% stated that fewer than 50% of their APIs were documented. And you can bust out these numbers however you'd like, right? There was a fact in there that basically said that something on the order of 70% believed that their 90% of their documentation or 90% of their APIs were documented. And no matter how you bust it out, and you can slice those numbers however you want, the reality of it is that these companies who believe that they were extremely mature and ready to go, so on and so forth, about half of them don't even have their APIs documented. I don't know how you define maturity, and I certainly don't know how you would necessarily define API security, but I think at the very, very core is understanding what APIs you have and how they interact and how they are documented, so on and so forth. And regardless of whatever percentage you're looking at here, the fact that there is a very sizable percentage of their APIs that are not documented stands to question what kind of security that they have in their environment. Again, I state that with the caveat that most of these companies believe that they already had very mature API security to begin with. So it is really kind of concerning when you see that, in this particular case, 41% stated that fewer than 50% of their APIs were documented.
Yeah, as you say, it's a real disconnect with the sense of belief that they had a secure maturity process in place. And I'm wondering also how accurate that 50% is, because it's hard to know what you don't know, right?
Well, yeah,
And
I mean,
I would certainly, just to that point of, if APIs aren't documented, you could probably really want to be questioning what kind of security do they have on them at all, if they're
and,
not, if they can't even bother to document them.
yeah, and that would be my question too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
how you're securing something that you don't know about, right? And again, there's automated tools that do some, and so on and so forth. I'm not dismissing any of that, but at the same time, not being able to know what your APIs are doing, more specifically, even more basic things like what information is being transmitted over that API, and not having that kind of core information is particularly scary to me. So yeah, that's one of those facts and figures that kind of jumped out at me as part of the survey when it was all said and done. When you look at the next one here, 31% stated that their primary concern is the need for more collaboration between DevOps, SecOps, security teams, and API experts. This is a trend that you're seeing, really across the board. Really, just kind of a lack of communication and a lack of expertise. One of the other facts that is kind of highlighted down there is that just the sheer lack of security experience, in experience and expertise. Really, it's something that generally we're seeing across all the different silos and across the whole spectrum. Just not having the kind of expertise that you need to be able to secure your environment in general. And then when you start talking about APIs, one of the things that I always talk about in general is that you might be the greatest security person in the world, but that doesn't mean that you're an expert in any kind of DevOps process or something like that, because they're not necessarily the same skill sets. I will be the first to say I'm a longtime CISSP for 20 some years now, and you really don't want me coding your environment. I promise it won't be good for you. It's not that I can't do it. I actually took all those classes, and in CS and C++ and so on and so forth, but that's not in anybody's interest for me to be doing that. And so when I look at the whole battery of CISSPs that I know in the world, the number that I would consider to be truly API security experts is not very high. Yet in our survey, 87% of the organizations claim to have their API security experts available internally. That number just doesn't mesh with reality. And so when you start taking and looking at the lack of communication between the various teams and a lack of that expertise, it really is one of those cases where there's no shame. In fact, I quite highly recommend that you do phone a friend to make certain that you are securing your APIs in a way that makes sense for your organization.
Yeah, I think when I looked at that graph, I thought, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
I'm often asked, is API security really different to what we're doing to secure web apps or mobile apps? And I think the answer, it depends, yes and no. I think the one you've called out there, that the big number there, it's collaboration, it's building the right teams, and it's that collaboration between those teams. And that's the same. That's probably the number one issue that we've been facing with AppSec for decades. But there's some specific things there as well. APIs come with unique challenges. I think the visibility into data and understanding what is PRI and how do I need to protect that. So, we've got some of the same problems we know about, and then we've got a whole load of new ones. So it remains challenging, I think, for practitioners.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you even brought up a couple of things right then and there that I think are particularly interesting when it's all said and done. When you start talking about just DevSec and what it means to be able to secure an environment, I think that's fine. I don't have any particular problem with that. But then it takes that next level security person to really have a better understanding of some of the nuances that come with API security. and how the data is treated and so on and so forth. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to say that your dev environment is not secure, or you're not employing people that have security in mind, but claiming to be an API expert, it's difficult. And it isn't, a dime a dozen kind of a person. So definitely kind of keep that in mind when you're taking and looking at your overall API security. The last figure that I kind of wanted to talk about, and this one I thought was particularly interesting, when you have a 60-40 split between proactive and reactive API security efforts. Again, not a huge surprise here. I really would kind of hope that it would be even more on the proactive side instead of less reactive. I think that this also is a little bit of an aspirational aspect kind of thing. I don't know that this number really is jiving with reality a whole lot. I think that a lot of people believe that they're being proactive and then really kind of underestimate the amount of time they are spending dealing with APIs and API security related issues. So 60-40 is a great number. I would love to see that number being 75-25. I would love to see that number being like 99-1. Again, that's more pie in the sky kind of thing, but that would be the ideal way of looking at that when it's all said and done. Colin?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty pleased with that. I would have thought it would be much more in the reactive, particularly because, when there's an incident and people are having to react, those are the things they'll remember when they come to filling in a response. So I think that's good. I think that's cause for optimism there.
Yeah, like I said, I hope that's real, right? I mean, and that's kind of the whole theme of this report when it's all said and done. How much are these numbers actually meshing with reality? And I'd love to think that it's a 60-40 split, that they're being 60%, proactive, taking care of security on the front end and not having to worry about as much in the back end. But a lot of evidence to show that that's not always necessarily the case. So to kind of summarize a little bit, some great facts, some great figures that came out of the report, and I highly recommend taking and going to the report and looking at the some of the various slides and such that are there when it's all said and done. There is a seismic gap in API security. If you want to go to the next slide, when you start taking and looking at some of the biggest problems that are out there, I think that a lot of enterprises suffer from a false sense of security, and they're, quite bluntly, I think a lot of them are hoping that they're buying a tool that's going to, magically solve their problems. I don't think that's the case, but it's definitely worth evaluating, from a realistic or maybe even a third-party aspect. What is your API security actually look like? I wanted to talk specifically about, API attacks are specific and traditional solutions don't usually prevent them. You do have to be kind of aware of those things, and your traditional, the tools that you have may not be specifically designed to take care of your overall API security. API attacks focus on the data and not the perimeter. Absolutely the case. They don't. Most of those that are participating in API attacks, they don't really care about your perimeter at all. They care about the data that your APIs are transmitting across the board. And if you have a depreciated or insecure API, it's a free-for-all, because they know full well that they can exfiltrate as much data as they want from those particular APIs, and there's a good chance you may not ever know that it was happening. Unlike some of your digital loss protection, data loss protection solutions, and so on and so forth, you may not ever even know with an insecure API that the data is being exfiltrated from your environment. And then lastly, one of the things that I think is worth talking about from a 42 Crunch perspective is new architectures and deployment patterns mean one app equals about 10 APIs. And I think that's probably true. It's not something that you're going to be able to just secure, onesie twosie on your own. And it's something that needs to be a continuous process. It's something that is You can't just take and deploy an API and expect never to revisit it. The horror stories that you get from that kind of methodology are particularly frightening, and it's worth mentioning that you do need a tool that has a certain amount of automation and continuous inspection of APIs to make certain that you are secure.
Yeah, I
Colin, did
think
you have anything you wanted to share with that?
yeah, I thought on that point, yeah, in particular that security's always had a problem. AppSec has always had a problem of scaling, and it's just got, as you say, about 10 times worse now. So anything that's going to require, manual review, or even stuff that requires people to go and install tools in CI/CD pipelines, isn't going to scale. If you're breaking developers' pipelines, you've just made that problem 10 times worse. A couple of other things on that: the data, not the perimeter. You made a great comment there about the fact that a lot of organizations are being breached and don't realize they are, and sometimes it can go for, and there's a couple of, I'm calling them mega breaches. There's a couple of breaches where organizations have lost sort of literally all their data. There's a couple in the last 6 months that we can think of that are featured in the newsletter. And it's taken the organization over a year or 18 months to even realize that something was happening, by which time it's too late.
Yeah, the average length of determining a breach is like 208 days.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's being optimistic, right?
Yeah.
So when you start taking and looking at APIs, and I don't know that I've seen a report that talks about specifically API breaches, but you got to figure that if you have an insecure API or some kind of API breach, there's a good chance that you may never see it. And so you're literally having the ability of losing, PII, IP data, indefinitely until that breach is somehow contained. But if you don't even, if it's not documented and you don't know that you have a breach and you continue using the API, then you may never actually even know how much data you've actually lost.
Yeah, and obviously the attackers, it's in their interests to keep under the radar, and I think we're seeing that
Absolutely.
they're getting quite clever in being able to evade normal IDS type systems.
Yep.
And then the second point you made there about the tools that aren't quite up to the job, very much agree with that. I come from a SaaS DaaS background myself, and I've run some of these tools against API code. It does a job. It does a good job of doing what it does, but it doesn't have the contextual awareness of what an API is, what the data structures look like. And I think we always try and sound out the message that it's a defense in depth. Use your SAST, use your DAST, use your WAFs. These are all great tools. They've got a role to play, but don't be entirely dependent on them, because there are going to be gaps. So try and get the best breadth of coverage that you can possibly achieve, and that's the way to do it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that isn't to disparage any of those tools, right? I mean, they do a good job at the things that they're supposed to do, but I think that we live with a false sense of security, thinking that, well, I bought this tool, it does great at doing this, therefore it's going to do everything else great too. And that's just not usually the case. You usually have to have something specific or a tool that's broad enough that it does cover, a bulk of the things that you're going to do. Not there, and I promise you, not every tool does every part of security well. It's not possible. If API security is an important part of your infrastructure and security vision, you're likely going to need a tool that is specifically designed to address that particular concern.
So we're just going to cover on from what Chris and I were discussing about the tools and talk a little bit more about what 42 Crunch offers. So we are a shift left, a developer-focused API security platform that really help organizations automate and scale API security. And the focus is on developers and empowering developers with first-class integrations into the IDE and tools. So the platform is loved by developers. We have integrations that work within most popular developer environments, particularly VS Code, where we've got over 500,000 downloads of our plugin in their marketplace. We allow developers to test their APIs, to audit the APIs, to scan the APIs right within the IDE. There's no long waits. I was actually just prior to this webinar, I was doing a test, and you get almost instant results. It's a couple of seconds. So to drive home that point that we made about you can't break the developer's pipeline, you can't break their flow. If you've got an app that has got 10 or 20 APIs, you can't have all of these developers sitting and waiting for tools to scan, right? And the fact that because we are contract based, we work off the open API specification of an API, we rarely reduce those false positives and false negatives, right? So it's a contract. The API is a contract. We know what that data should look like, and we can use that to ensure that there's low false positives and false negatives. API governance, you have an open API specification. You can set standard policies and specifications for your organization, and the 42 Crunch platform can govern those right across your entire organization with a single risk dashboard. And the ability to automate and scale, we've got customers using this platform. They're operating with thousands of APIs. It really is an enterprise-wide scalable solution for managing your APIs. Okay, driving down into the three core components. So if we start on the left-hand side, if we like to think of this as at the time that you're designing your API, so you're working with your specification, so you're working with your data teams, your product managers, and you're defining that API. We have an audit product, so that will ingest your open API specification, and it will look for data and security touch points. So as an example, if you have a request that is taking an input parameter, you can constrain that input parameter to be of a specific data type. So that means that you won't accept data that is in the invalid format. You've got things that can check your security controls. What transport security are you using? And we can score on over 300 different categories through that audit. And we give you a report. We've got, as I said, we've got IDE experience right in line. We can integrate into, for instance, GitHub Actions, where you can ingest those audit findings straight into the GitHub code scanning, or you can view those on the 42 Crunch platform. And that gives you an idea of what your completeness and the accuracy of your API contract is, right? And the idea is that it's truly shift left. It's before people even start coding. So get that contract right, get that contract agreed with your data teams, with your PI teams, with whoever needs to be involved at that design stage, and get that contract right. And then from there, you go toward generating code. And that's where the API scanner, that's the second part of that product. An analogy, it's a little bit like a DAST scan, but it's for APIs, and it takes as its source of truth that contract, your open API specification. And what it does is it exercises your API according to that contract. So taking that example of a method, taking a parameter, what it'll try and do is it'll give you what we call the happy path. It'll give you the correct value, say an integer. And then what it'll try and do is it'll give you incorrect values and fuzz that data, right? So it tries to cause your API to misoperate, and it reports back on ways in which your API misoperated so that you can go and cover those in your code and make that API much more rugged, right? So the idea is that those two products work in tandem. And in our most recent release of the VS Code extension, you can literally try those two simultaneously while you're coding. You can edit your contract, you can test it, you can tweak the code, you can run it again, and you run that in a tight cycle. So you audit, scan, audit, scan, audit, scan, until you've got an API that's compliant. And then finally, as Chris and I discussed previously, the APIs are always under attack. No matter if you've got a perfectly written API and it's perfectly secure, there are people that are going to be trying to break into that API. They're going to be trying to brute force it. They're going to be trying to forge JWT tokens. They're going to be doing all manner of things that they shouldn't to that API. So it's important that you have a specific dedicated API protection, right? So you've got your web application firewall, you've got your API gateway, API manager. These are all great. There's certain categories of things that those products aren't going to protect you against. For instance, they don't handle traffic inspection or data integrity particularly well. Where they do, they can introduce very long lags and really degrade the performance. So we've got a very performant micro firewall that sits directly in front of the API and protects at a transaction level. And then we've also got the ability to monitor and integrate and push those results to a number of standard platforms. And then obviously those three tools all operate in a continuous fashion across your CI/CD integrations into pretty much everything you could wish for, to make sure that those operate in an inobtrusive manner. Right. And this is all about empowering developers. I think the findings of what the root causes of issues with security, top of the list was that collaboration, the culture of collaboration. Really, the way to do this, I've been doing this for over a decade now. What really works is the no shame, no blame. Right, empower developers, help them do their job better. Right, you're basically taking away unexpected or unwanted work. We wanted to get that proactive, that was 40%. We want to get that down to ultimately towards 0. And the way to do this is be proactive and find the issues further left. And what's important here as well is that low false positive. And I know developers' reactions when they see a scan report that's got thousands of findings. Right, it can be quite debilitating to deal with that. And what tends to happen is people will ignore that. So, and this is the big benefit with API security, is because it's contract based. You can, the reality is that you can produce very low false positive reports. Right, and the issue is, the main benefit here is that your mean time to fix, you're not waiting to something to hit production to fail. You can fix it and catch it, particularly with that scanner. The scanner is pretty comprehensive in what it's finding. And it can find a lot of very, very simple issues almost as you introduce them in your IDE. Right, trust but verify. So the way that security teams should be tackling this problem of API security, there are not enough security people. There's not enough people, certainly with the right skills. Work on a policy, understand what your corporate security requirements are, understand what transport layer security you should be using, things like how you should be protecting your data. Formulate these in code. So go and develop policies, give your development teams examples of what good looks like, standard patterns that you have for implementing certain things. I can talk at depth and on webinars about the way people should be using authentication, authorization, how they should be handling JWTs. There's standard patterns. So empower the developers, give them that knowledge, right? And then just verify. And the way to verify that is check the audit, do the scans, and check that they're working. And, make those results visible to dev teams as early as possible. I've been doing work now with our GitHub Actions integration. You can actually that runs quick enough that you can put the audits and the scan right into a pull request process. So you do a pull request, and by the time you come to reviewing it, 42 crunches has already gone and audited and scanned that API and said, yes, you haven't introduced anything new. So that is the way forward. Fast results early as possible. As we'd said at the beginning, one of my other great pleasures in life is that I edit and curate the API security.io weekly newsletter. This is a newsletter that we produce for API security enthusiasts. We have quite a following on that newsletter. I cover breaches. It's very instructive to learn from the mistakes that others make to help us understand what the real world looks like. What kind of breaches we're having. And there's often just general industry news. It's a pretty popular resource and certainly a pleasure to produce. So if you're not already a subscriber, please go along to that and subscribe to learn more.
Great. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Chris. That was fantastic. Just before we go we're almost at the end, folks. So before we go to answer some questions, I'd like to just share links to some important documentation that really reinforces some of the findings our presenters have talked about. Firstly, many of you will, or many of our customers indeed, are using a variety of API gateways And ostensibly, folks think these are delivering enough on security. However, while they do a good job of supporting and managing API usage, from authentication to rate limiting to analytics, they were not designed to automate or scale security for APIs. So here at 42 Crunch, we've built a series of integrations into the leading API gateways to help enterprises reduce the manual tasks and automate security for API workflows. So here's a link to the relevant documentation. And last but not least, a reminder that all of you will receive a free copy of the work done by Chris and team at EMA. So again, we'll make that available to you after the webinar. So just a few questions, folks, have been coming in thick and fast. So I'm going to just call a few out and ask our presenters to answer. And the first one is to you, Chris, I think. So it says that the research seems to have been for North American companies only, but do you think we can extrapolate the same trends for companies in other parts of the world based on your kind of experience?
Yeah, you can. It is when we do this research, the statistical deviation between like North America and Europe is usually less than 3 or 4%. So when you're reading the report, understand that we pulled mainly North America, but most of the time when it comes to security and specifically security, most of those trends usually correlate directly to what's going on other parts of the world. Notable exception is when it comes to how Europe and North America, the differences that they handle in data security. But even the little bit that I have talked to from an API security perspective, you're going to find that those trends are almost universally the case.
Gotcha. Okay, next question is, I noticed that over 30% of companies only look at securing their APIs at the production point. So what are they actually doing there at production? And what are the implications for those companies that are only doing it at that stage? So I guess that's to both of you. Maybe Chris, you take it first.
Yeah, my thinking is that I think there is well, you look at it two ways. One, they're either never addressing it until it gets to a production stage, which is another whole set of frightening that we kind of talked about. I think, though, for the most part, they're addressing specific vendor due diligence requirements, maybe a regulatory requirement, maybe some kind of checklist that they need to have to pass muster with a particular vendor that's using that API. I think by and large, it's usually kind of check blocks, some kind of very, very quick and dirty regression testing, and then the checkbox is checked and then they're out the door. I don't think you're going to be doing any kind of design work or very heavy kind of API work once it's in a production environment. The most you're going to do is kind of spot checking and so on and so forth. Colin, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was wondering if the breakdown between what they might be doing at that late stage is what combination of that is monitoring, so out of line, and then in line with protection, with more firewall oriented products.
Sure.
I'd be interested to know what that split looks like, because my perception is a lot of organizations are making claims that they're doing API security, but what it comes down to is it's a monitoring product that is being used to monitor rather than anything that could actually protect you. So it's not so proactive. You're going to have to wait until you've been breached and see if you detected it. That'd be what the first thing I'd be looking at. And then the other topic on that one was I think people are still reliant on, and I'm basing this just thinking of some of the articles in the API Security IO newsletter, is people are still reliant on pen test. They'll still wait until they've got a product through to release through a year's waterfall release cycle and then go and do a pen test on it. And the real problem that you have is, with no disrespect to people involved in doing pen testing, but API security is a little different. And that would be one of the takeaways I'd give people. If you are building an API heavy product, or with specifically an API product, make sure that you go and select your pen testers carefully. You make sure that those people that are doing your pen test on your APIs that have specific credentials or have an established track record, because they are a little bit different. The techniques and the exploits are different. So just watch that one. Don't be reliant on necessarily be reliant on the same guys you use for everything else.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. So if we implement security earlier in the life cycle as proposed here, does this mean 42Crunch is only offering testing tools, or do you also offer runtime protection? I think you covered that, Colin, but maybe you just want to for the questioner just reinforce that.
Yeah, no, so certainly. So I think predominantly the first encounter with 42Crunch would be the audit and scan, because the two work so well in tandem. It's a very natural way to use the product is being able to audit the code and then scan the runtime, right? And then use those two in harmony. But as I said earlier, you're still going to be, your APIs are still going to be under probe, under attack. So you really want to complement that with your protection. And the advantage of having an API that is scanning correctly and has been audited is you're actually giving the firewall a very accurate representation of what your API is supposed to do, what it is contracted to do. So it means that your firewall protection can be very accurate and very precise. So it behaves a whole lot differently to the way that a WAF would, which is working on the negative security model, right? It's trying to block known bad, whereas the API firewall is positive security model that's only allowing known good, right? There's a distinct difference there. And if you get that contract right, then your firewall can perform very well and very accurately.
Great. Okay, folks, that's all the time we have. So again, I'd like to extend a big thanks to Chris Steffen from EMA for joining us today. And a copy of his report, as I said, will be sent to you all. And as usual, to Colin Dominy, a regular appearer on the 42Crunch channel. Thanks, folks, and I'll leave it there.